Good afternoon. How's everybody doing?
Very good.
Yeah? It's the last day, and you're almost at the end of this conference. It's kind of hard to believe, isn't it? It seems like I just got off the plane to be here, and shortly I'll be getting on a plane to leave. And in between those two travel experiences, we've had this conference. And I feel very comfortable saying that I think, from my experience in the last couple of days, this conference has delivered what we come to conferences for. Right? I've connected with people, been networking, learned more about what other people are doing. We try to learn more things that we can take back with us to our organizations. And that's certainly happened. That happens in the talks, right? And all the talks that I've attended were spectacular. And that's not easy. When you have a short amount of time to make a presentation like this, you have a big responsibility because you want to deliver something that's relevant and valuable, but you also want to deliver it in a way that the people listening to you can retain it, understand it, and then use it. And that's a tall order. It's a lot of responsibility. And I don't like responsibility, not too much of it. So I did what most of us do. I went to an LLM to share that responsibility, right? And I asked ChatGPT, I prompted it with, what are the ways of learning? And when you do that, you get a response that comes back that's pretty verbose, but inside of this big response, there's a couple of things that I think we all are already familiar with. As humans, we're wired to remember things from stories, better than just listing independent facts. Stories give us context, and they give us a way to remember it. It's interesting because the payload of a story is going to be larger than the payload of a list of facts. But we're wired to remember that story better, even though it's more. The other thing about a story is the narrative around it gives you metadata about that information, so that when you recall it later to use it somewhere, you've got some metadata about that information to help you marshal it and apply it to your use case. So stories give us information in a way that's easier for us to retain, understand, and use. So we're going to start with a story. There are two API technologists having drinks. So far, a very believable story, agree? And they're having drinks after a meeting about a new project. Still very believable. And our first technologist says, this new project needs an API strategy. I just don't know how to start it. So this is where I'm going to start to unpack this a little bit. This could be a new project. This new project could be a startup. It could be an enterprise that's going to launch a new product or a service, or maybe it's not revenue oriented. Maybe it's improving a process, some new operations. But the thing that all of us already know, and it's certainly been re-emphasized in the last couple of days, is that anything we do that's software related, application related, is going to involve APIs. So any new project that you get assigned to is probably going to have an API program associated with it, maybe even enough to warrant a new API program. The other thing we see in the second part of this sentence or this statement from this first technologist is that he seems to be responsible for the API management approach, or at least to think about it strategically, or he's on a team that's responsible for that. Even if you don't have direct responsibility for the API management platform or infrastructure you're going to use, or you don't have direct responsibility for the strategy around this API program, it's good to be able to think about it and understand why it is the way it is, because that makes you a much more valuable contributor. What does our second technologist say? He comes to the rescue. I got you covered, right? I'll give you some tips on how you can think strategically about API programs and how you can think about managing API management. What I'm going to do for the next 20 minutes is give you some ways that you can think strategically, specifically around APIs. These tips can help you in any kind of process where you want to be more strategic in your thinking, but we are talking about APIs today. And if you like what I say, you can buy me some drinks later. I'm kind of trying to stay away from alcohol for a while. So if you want to buy me a coffee, even though coffee's free, that's good. You can do that as well. There's only going to be one takeaway from my talk. API engineers must be able to think strategically around APIs. Now, the first part of this sentence I struggled with. I was going to use the phrase to be relevant. You have to be able to think strategically, and that felt a little abrasive. And then I thought, let's say that in the future, you're going to have to be able to think strategically. But in the future is a vague phrase. That could mean tomorrow, next year, 5 years from now. The phrase going forward means you're going to need to be able to think strategically tomorrow and the next day and going forward, but you also need to think about it today. You need to have these skills. So what I'm going to cover in this brief talk, hopefully that will be valuable for you, is I'll give you some ideas on how to get yourself oriented to think strategically about API programs, and then I'll give you a few questions that really hone in and focus in on what I think are some of the critical parts to make an API program successful. I was with Gartner for a while, and one of the things they teach us is when you're going to make a presentation like this and you want to substantiate a takeaway, the first thing you do is you describe what the landscape looks like today so you can validate that your takeaway is relevant and true. So let's talk about some of the things that all of us are hearing today, this whole notion of unbundling. For me, the way I like to think about it is if I had a spectrum, and this is an all-in-one API management platform that does everything for me, from design to testing to a portal, a gateway. And on this end of the spectrum, I've got a different vendor product for each one of those components. I have a vendor for design, a vendor product for testing, and then a portal from a different vendor, and then gateways from other vendors. So those are sort of the two extremes. From my experience, where a lot of people are is sort of left of center of that spectrum. They've got an underlying base platform that's their all-in-one API management solution, but there's some component that has a specific requirement where they needed to go find a vendor product to satisfy that requirement. Maybe they needed something specific around testing. One of the most common places we see that happening is with portals. Portals are that magic place where what we build meets the consumer that's going to use it. And they're critically important. And very often, depending on your culture, your organization, the market you're in, the type of audience you're trying to serve, you may have some peculiar requirements around how that portal needs to look and operate. And for that reason, you may often shop around for a particular vendor that's got something specific to satisfy that requirement. Have we heard the news that APIs are ubiquitous now? So anything that you're going to build is going to have APIs related to it. And so that means that consumers of APIs are increasingly having to trust the builders of APIs, that we're strategically making sure that we're putting governance around them so that we're delivering quality, resilience, and performance. One of the things that seems to be a trend that I'm very happy to see is that we're building APIs to satisfy business capabilities. How many of us in here are developers? We had that survey earlier today, and a large portion of us are. As a developer, it's fair for me to say we like to build things, and we like to build cool things, and we like to use the latest tech and the latest processes. But we need to remember that what we're building has a particular use case that we're trying to satisfy. The influence needs to come from the outside in. There's a market with a demand. Somebody puts together a business model to satisfy that market, and then we build technology to satisfy that business model. That should be the way the flow of influence goes and what drives what we build. And I see more and more of that happening, which is satisfying to see. I already talked about this magic place, the portal, where the builders of APIs go to meet the consumers of APIs. And I'm seeing a lot more attention in that space. You see sometimes the notion of centralizing an API portal when you may have a multitude of different gateways and different API technologies, but you want one central place for discovery of all those APIs. And then what do our friends at Gartner have to say? Now, these are public quotes that I'm able to share these with you. But Gartner tells us then in a couple of years, all of us are going to be using AI in our development processes. Have you noticed in the talks the last couple of days, there's either mention of AI in the talk or there's a badge of honor that they didn't mention AI, right? In a couple of years, it's going to be so commonplace, it'll be like, talking about an IDE or a load balancer. It's just going to be something that all of us use all of the time. This is a statement from Gartner that pretty much proves my takeaway. So in essence, I could stop here and save us all another 20 minutes, but what's the fun in that, right? So Gartner is already saying, has been saying, that even developers, everybody on the engineering team is going to have to learn more think more strategically. As we introduce these AI tools and the AI capabilities, a phenomenon that's happening is that we're uncovering these gaps in our technology team. Now, this sentence doesn't identify what those gaps are. I'm going to propose 2 gaps to you. One is the obvious one. We're all going to need to understand how to leverage AI tooling and all the things related to AI, Gen AI, machine learning, and so forth. So that's an obvious gap, but most of us are really far down the road on closing that gap. The other gap that's being referred to here is the sentence right above it. Having the skills to be able to think strategically, specifically around API management. So I want to share with you a couple of API programs that I was involved with. Is this going to work? Yay, pointer works. So this one to the left, CPG, consumer packaged goods, manufacturers that make things like paper towels, cereal, canned goods, anything you would see in a grocery store or a drugstore. And these manufacturers compete intensely for your attention, for you to come buy their product. And one of the things they do to incent you to buy their product is they put discounts out, coupons, promotions, rebates, sweepstakes. And what we built was a storehouse where we could have an API that the manufacturers could use to send us the definitions of those offers, those incentives, and then we would have an API connection to the retailers at their point of sale so that when a shopper came through, we would get their basket of products. That basket would be sent to us through an API. We could look through all those offers and see if this basket qualified for any of those offers. And then we would send that list of incentives back to the point of sale system to say this shopper can have this discount, they're eligible for this rebate, whatever it may be. A beautiful project, an engineer's dream. It was something really fun to do. And working with the manufacturers, we had a relatively smaller landscape of clients that were going to use that API. But working with the retailers was gigantic. There's lots of retailers that have lots of stores, and each one of them was a client point that we had to integrate with. A daunting task until somebody sat down and started thinking strategically. One of the strategic things you do when you're thinking about APIs is you need to know who your customer is. And in this particular space, grocery retailers, at least in North America, every one of them, well, 85% of them use a point of sale system from one of 3 vendors, IBM, NCR, or Retalix. So what we did instead of going directly to the retailers is we went to these POS vendors and lobbied for them to have an interrupt in their POS process to be able to make API calls. And we had the fortune, I have to admit, that everybody wanted this. The manufacturers wanted this, the retailers wanted this, the shoppers wanted this, and the POS vendors wanted this. So they did the work, and they implemented that. But once that was implemented, remember what is the most challenging part of your API program? You build something, you secure it, it's great, you publish it, but then what? Somebody has to adopt it, right, and use it. Somebody has to connect to it. For this program, the connection to these retailers, 0 development. They just had to configure something in their POS to be able to call out to our API. 0 development. That made it achievable. It was beautiful. This is another project. It was still in the same space. It was with consumer packaged goods manufacturers. And there was this one particular holding corporation that owned a multitude of brands. Every one of the brands had a website, so that the brand's enthusiasts, the fans of the brand, could go log in and register at this website and get things like recipes or sign up for newsletters and so forth. What they wanted was for the experience to be that if you went to one of their brand sites and registered, you were now registered at all their brand sites. So we solved it pretty easily. We just had a back-end data store. We used an open source CRM. I'm not going to mention the name, but it was a sweet CRM. And we used that just to be our data house. And we created an API that these different brand sites could use for registration and authentication, such that if you registered at one brand site, you are now going to be eligible to log into any of the brand sites. And then this last one was still in e-commerce. It was an e-commerce site. And their business model was to have independent distributors/representatives that promoted the products and they would send people to the site to shop. And the way these representatives did that mostly was through digital properties like their own websites, through blogs, something like that, where they could basically present the products and somebody would see the product and click on it, much like an affiliate program, and be directed to that website. But these independent reps and these distributors were not developers. So even though we built what we thought was a really good API, easy to use, well-documented SDKs, we had people out here that were building websites with WordPress and Wix and Square and those types of things. They really weren't developers. So how did we solve this problem? We built some tooling that these reps could log into, and they could indicate to us what products they wanted to market, and even give us information like what were their brand colors, what were their type fonts that they used on their site, so we could replicate their brand image. And we would give them a snippet of code. They just copied and pasted, because all of these web development tools have elements you can drop into a page where you can insert a snippet of code. I'm sure you've all seen that. So we took advantage of that as well. So now these reps are onboarding to us with a copy-paste process. It took like 2 or 3 steps, and a rep would have what they needed on their site. And then all their visitors could go to the site, see the products, and be directed to the e-commerce. Now here's what's interesting. This program had no API management at all. I'm going to date myself a little bit, but this was before API management existed. In one of the talks I was in yesterday, Christoph with Pronovix showed the API vendor product landscape, which is 2,500 plus vendors now and products. This was before that existed, right? This one had API management. This one had API management. But what's interesting, if you were to ask me which of these I felt like were the most successful programs, this one kicked butt. I mean, because it was so easy for us to onboard these retailers, we proliferated our solution out into the marketplace, and we gained market share like crazy. This one was successful because it was so easy to onboard and start to promote products on your blog or your site. We made it really easy for somebody to adopt that API. This one was challenging, and it was the more typical way of how we think about doing things. We published an API. We tried to make sure it was well designed. We had SDKs available, lots of documentation. But in this scenario, we had to get in the project queue for each one of these brand websites and deal with their backlog and their timing, their availability, and then there were technical questions. So even though we did it in the more traditional way with this middle program, it was more challenging. And all I'm trying to say is that when you're thinking about your API program, step outside of the box a little bit. Be innovative with how you're trying to get it adopted by your marketplace. And ask this particular question: what's it like to connect to your API? If you were a consumer, what would it be like to connect to your API? And think of how you would want to improve it. And ask this question: are you building APIs reactively or proactively? What I often see is very typically in an organization, an application shows up that needs an API, and somebody go builds an API for that application. Then another application pops up that needs an API, they go build an API for that application. So an inventory of APIs starts to accumulate from a reactive type of approach, instead of sitting down and planning out ahead of time, what do we need? And it should be easy enough to do that. I like to refer to it as an API relationship diagram. That may not be a good term for everybody, but I like to choose my own terms when I'm talking about these things. And this is really the spirit of domain-driven design. You take a business domain, you understand what entities are involved in there, what the processes are that define this domain, and you can sit down and you can think about what APIs do I need to have access to these entities and this data and these processes. And as you go through that, you're basically creating an architecture or a map of what APIs you're going to need. And it lets you do things like, you can look at this API, this customer API, and one of the first things you notice, if that one API is going to do all of this, some of these are pretty simple, but billing information and history are probably a little more complex. And there's probably going to certainly be instances where somebody only wants billing info and doesn't need the rest of this. So it makes sense to break these out too. And now this customer API is going to call a couple of other APIs, and you're orchestrating your APIs into a business capability. These kind of thought patterns and strategic thinking happen just by putting something down on paper and thinking it through. And now you have an API architecture or roadmap of what you need to build, instead of being reactive and just building them as they're needed. Some of the benefits you can get from this relationship diagram, is you're going to be aligned with the business because you built it from the domain definition. You're going to have the granularity you want of your APIs because you sat down and thought about how do I need to break this down so I don't have these monolithic APIs that do too much. You'll be able to think about the types of APIs you need. We had some great talks in this room earlier about GraphQL. Is that applicable to your situation? Do you need an event-driven architecture? You'll go through all this type of thinking from this type of process. You'll be able to identify what do you need for a minimal viable product if this is a launch of something new. And then you can know what APIs to put into your future roadmap so you can know where to focus your efforts. And you'll be able to identify which ones have to have product management because if the ones that support your external experience or your application experience must have product management around them. This is a terrible slide, so I apologize for it, but I put it here anyway. Just to quickly say that there's 3 perspectives you can take to think strategically about your API program. Think about this API relationship diagram I just talked about, and you'll answer questions like, what are my shared APIs? Where do I need product management? Am I aligned with the business? And then think about how you have to implement your API program. Are you going to need to be hosted in the cloud? Can you do things on premise? Do you have regulatory concerns to think about? Who owns security and protection? A must. You need to define that. And then this third point of perspective, I refer to it as API management relevance. What's important to your solution? If you don't use EDA, if you don't have an event-driven architecture in your solution, that's fine. It just doesn't make sense for you. But don't spend too much time learning it either, and don't go buy tools that give you EDA. You'd be surprised how often I would see that. And it's not that you don't need to know about it. You need to be aware of everything, but just prioritize what's relevant to you so you invest your time appropriately. And then a hierarchy of concerns. We're stepping into the world of Paul right now. This is my opinion. This is the list of concerns I think around an API program in the order they need to be thought about. You'll notice security is number 3. That is not in any way to say security is less important than anything else. But anybody that's involved in security knows that when you start thinking about security and protection, the only way you're going to put together an effective security program is to know what you're protecting and know how it works and know what its nuances are. So the first thing you need to do is know what you're building, which is your API relationship diagram, and then how you're going to build it and what its functionality is going to be. We heard some comments earlier in the security talk about it's not just what the response is that you get from APIs that security hackers can use to take advantage of, but how it behaves. Even response times give them clues of how they can try to find ways to penetrate your API. And once you've done all that frictionless adoption, which is what I talked about in those other examples, try to be innovative in how your API gets propagated out to the customers that need to use it. And once you've got all that done, you can think about developer experience. And then when I say developer experience in this context, I'm talking about the builder's experience, the people that are building your APIs, what kind of process they go through, how much automation do they have, how much governance do they have to comply with, what's their CI/CD process look like. And then, of course, you have to have observability. You need to know what your APIs are doing because you better find out something's wrong before your clients do, right? And so this is another complicated slide. You can look at it later or take a picture of it really quickly if you'd like. But it just speaks to how you can approach each one of these levels of concern, the hierarchy of concerns, how you can approach them, what tools you can use, and then what benefits you get from that. And the thing that I've sort of reiterated several times already is if you look at number 4, this frictionless adoption, try to be innovative. It's absolutely true that you want well-designed APIs, you want really good documentation, you want to help your developers with SDKs and code samples, but if you can go a step beyond that and do something, if there's an opportunity within your market to do something innovative to get that adoption to happen even faster, don't be afraid to think about that. How does an orchestra work? An orchestra has a guy standing in front of a group that you guys could be an orchestra. And I could have a brass section here and a wind section there and a percussion section back there and a string section here. Each one of those are different technologies in how to produce sound. And each one of those technologies has different people using it to do that instrument. How do you coordinate all that so it's not just a bunch of noise? The first thing we do is everybody tunes together. And then we have a common communication tool. We use music notation to speak to each other about what we're supposed to do. And then we have a music score to say, this is our objective. This is what we're trying to deliver. That's how you make this potential field of chaos into something beautiful. And API management is very similar to that. especially when we talk about what's going to happen with AI tools. You're going to have APIs that are built by yourself, by your peers. We already have APIs that are built from tooling. Integration platforms can spit out APIs like they're nothing. And then Gen AI is going to be creating APIs for us as well. How do we coordinate all that? We do that with standards, specifications, and the roadmaps that we're going to have, what we're trying to build, what we've already talked about multiple times. So I'm back to my takeaway now, that we need to be able to think strategically because of the way things are moving and the kind of tooling that we have. There's so many pressure points that are telling us that even in a small project, we may have a small API program that needs to have some kind of management and strategy around it. And this responsibility of strategic thinking and managing API management is being distributed throughout the whole organization. So as developers that are used to give me requirements and here's the code, that's what our normal process is, how do we back up and look at the whole picture and think strategically so that we can know that we're building the right thing the right way, and we've thought about all the possible eventualities that we need to consider. Think about a relationship diagram, which is basically just sitting down and thinking about all the things you need to build, what your full API roadmap looks like. Go through your hierarchy of concerns so you're investing your time and your attention in a smart way, and then consider yourself a conductor. There's nothing scary about that, because if you have standards in place, and if you have the right communication protocols between everybody, and you have this roadmap that everybody knows what they're building, then you can be that conductor and make all of it come together and create something really beautiful. And then ask yourself some pointed questions. What's it like to connect to your API? And are you building APIs in a planned way, or are you just reacting? Paul Dumas, absolutely thrilled to be here. I love this conference. It's the second one I've attended. I think they're great. I have a long history as an API strategist and working in APIs in different aspects, from coding to architecture and so forth. Spent some time at Gartner. Love Gartner. It's a beautiful place. It's a great place to work. So I am very thankful that I had the opportunity to be here to speak, and I hope you guys have had a great conference. Enjoy this rainy day. We have one more keynote, and then I think you'll be free to go. Thank you very much.